In the United States, the right to vote is fundamental, much the same as going out to eat. But this year, with a presidential election in the shadow of a pandemic, voting might be like the restaurant business, with more restricted capacity on site and more need for remote transactions. That's why the advocacy group Common Cause Massachusetts wants new measures to protect voting rights. To tell us about legislation backed by the group is its executive director, Pam Wilmot. Thank you very much for being with us, Pam.
Thank you for having me.
Pam, it wasn't so long ago. I think Common Cause said that in Massachusetts, the reliability of the voting infrastructure was pretty good. But what's changed since then?
Well, COVID-19 has changed since then. In fact, I think we've always said we could do better. Massachusetts has never been on the forefront of election modernization. We've caught up a lot over the past 5 years. We've made a lot of changes in our election laws for the better, but we still are a pretty old-fashioned state with a lot of, we have a decentralized voting system. 351 cities and towns do actually mail out the absentee ballots. They process the returns. They conduct the elections. The Secretary of State is overall the chief election officer, but they don't actually conduct elections. And that sets us up for a real problem. Currently, only 3 to 5% of the ballots are cast by mail. But with a pandemic, we all want to stay home and vote from the safety of our four walls. And many, many states make that much easier, and we need to do a tremendously better job in the fall than we have ever done before, an unprecedented increase in mail-in ballots.
Well, in a way, we have to be grateful to Wisconsin for its experiment with this year's presidential primary. What did you learn from that?
Well, what we learned is that even election officials with the best intentions cannot actually fulfill their duties in the middle of a pandemic without a lot of preparation and changes in the way that we actually do our elections. So one of the problems in Wisconsin is they actually have no excuse absentee, which we don't here. We've taken care of that for the spring by expanding, our physical excuse to cover COVID-19. Or fear of. But the problem was they literally could not ship out the number of absentee ballots required in time for the election. That was physically impossible. And I fear here in Massachusetts, we will be in the same position come November. The fall, September 1st election is a little bit lower turnout, so I think that's a little bit less at risk. We obviously need to do a ton for that. But everyone is going to want to cast a ballot in November, and we could very easily be in another surge, or certainly I think everything will change going forward in terms of people's concern about being in crowds, having particular parts of our population that are more at risk, particularly unable to cast ballots. So that's why we are pushing for the state to send every registered voter a ballot in November. That's something that many states have done, many states are moving to do, and it's the best practice, the cheapest, the most efficient, and the most effective. There's a lot of other steps that need to be there too, and we can't totally eliminate in-person voting because sometimes people don't get their ballot, or it's improperly marked, or they have language access issues, or other disabilities that require assistance of an actual in-place voting opportunity. So we need to preserve that, but greatly expand our number of voters that vote by mail. I expect that we'll have somewhere between 70 and 90% of the voters in Massachusetts, depending on how we do it, want to vote by mail. But we could end up, if we don't make any significant changes like Wisconsin, where 70% requested that ballot and only a fraction of that percentage actually got them.
Well, one of the concerns about voting by mail, and I think maybe the worst case was in a close congressional race in North Carolina, was that there could be fraud. There could be some kind of ballot harvesting that goes on. Is there a way that you can prevent that from happening and still have a lot more voting by mail?
Absolutely. So many states have had vote by mail exclusively or almost exclusively for many, many years. Oregon, Washington, Colorado are good examples. There's ballot tracking software. There's a little code that goes along with it. You have signature matching that can be automated. Other protections to ensure that the ballot is actually in the correct hands. The concerns that people have about fraud actually apply across the board. So the same people that are saying you can't vote by mail are also saying, let's not vote in person either. So we have to be better about our voting lists, and that's why our organization and others in our coalition push for something called the Electronic Registration Information Center. Legislation passed 2 years ago requiring Massachusetts to join that, and that cleans up our data by matching it with other states and with the federal government and death notices and the rest, and our state just hasn't gotten around to doing that. That's one thing I'm going to see if we can actually do in between now and the November election, because having good voting lists is good for everyone. It is not a partisan issue. It is something that we all need.
Unpack this a little bit more, because one of the things that I remember from the normal way of voting at the polls is you have voters who move to another part of the same city, and they show up and then they're told that they're not on the list. What happens if you transpose that to remote voting?
Yeah, it's an issue. The ballot would come if you have to update your information or be a part of this service, the Electronic Registration Information Center, that tries to do that on a monthly basis. So there would need to be a big campaign to tell voters to go to the online voter registration system to update their information in time for them to get the ballot at the correct address. That would be true regardless of the process, but the stakes are particularly high with the more efficient model.
What about poll workers? Because one thing I notice, even when the turnout isn't that high, you have maybe 2 or 3 people sitting at the same table. The room isn't that big. Doesn't that have to be dealt with in some way too?
Absolutely. So one, if you had a full vote by mail system, you would need to have in-person voting, but you could put it in a smaller number of locations. Now, many of our communities only have 1 location anyway. So one, we will have less traffic, which will be good. But 2, we think some of the set of the polling place and the requirement there's actually a requirement for 8 different poll workers to be present in each location. And it's just not necessary. The town clerks and advocacy organizations have said there's at least 2 of those positions that absolutely do not need to be there. And so care will have to be paid both to who do you recruit as poll workers, because that's another thing that happened in Wisconsin and other states is poll workers really just didn't even show up for work or called in the week before to say, I'm sorry, I just can't come. And part of that is that many of our poll workers are retired, they're even elderly, and they're at the highest risk for COVID-19. So it makes sense that they wouldn't. So one of the changes that we're recommending is to loosen up some of the residency requirements and other things so that we can get more young people into serving our election system.
What about the way all these votes are tabulated, especially if more of them are cast before Election Day?
That's one big problem with the way we process absentee ballots. We currently do not scan them until they go to Election Day to the actual precincts and then are scanned in. And that's something you could not do if you have 70% voting by mail, regardless of whether they're sent a ballot or not. You have to do central tabulation. And that requires new equipment for many communities. We do have a fund of money that was appropriated almost 20 years ago that can still be tapped. It is allocated to Massachusetts for equipment purchases. But there are lots of sort of sub issues that go down even further that we need to address through this legislation. And that is central tabulation is one of them for sure.
What about security, protecting the vote from hacking or even needing a sort of a paper backup? How do you work that into these kinds of reforms?
So we currently vote by mail. Vote by paper, whether we're by mail or in person. That would stay. I don't see that changing. Some people may have called for internet voting, but we're nowhere close to that in terms of technology. There's no way to do that safely. So we currently have an audit of our general election of 3% of the precincts where ballots have been cast, to double check that the count was correct and that machines are working correctly. That will stay in place. That should stay in place. In fact, we've been pushing for it to be expanded so that we can ensure that the count is accurate. Unlike banking or other kinds of commercial transactions, we cannot afford to lose 10% of our votes. And that is something that commercial entities regularly lose to fraud and other things. That's not something we can do, and not something that we do. I think that some of the threats that have been out there are certainly present, and we need to protect against them, but I think people can feel more secure that our election officials have been paying attention to these. We do have paper ballots so that we can double count and make sure that the count is accurate.
In practice, looking at the whole country, we can easily see voting security as being an issue in the presidential election. Massachusetts, we're not supposed to be a swing state. Is this that much of a big deal?
Well, I think it would be, you always want to be safe regardless. And so having a double count is important. The Electoral College does mean that the chances of Donald Trump winning Massachusetts are exceedingly small. In fact, I can't imagine a scenario at the moment that would make that actually happen. So the stakes may not be as high as they are in a state like Ohio or Pennsylvania or Florida or all the other swing states that we know of. But we still have other ballot races. We have a primary race for the US Senate where numbers may be important. We've had many elections won by small numbers of votes. And we want to get it right because voting is our constitutional duty and it is our right. And we need to have the ability to effectively cast our ballot and not trade off our health for our exercising our right.